Hello students, today we're going to talk about finding the slope from a table. Make sure you have your green paper out because we're going to do a warm-up first, and then you will have a worksheet to do after we are done. So today our learning target is we will find the slope of a line from a table. So for your warm-up, I want you to identify all the points that are found on this line that you see here, and then find the slope of the line. So you're going to identify all the points just like we did yesterday, but I want you to do all of them, not just 2 of them, and I want you to actually find the slope of the line. Pause the video if you need time to do this. Alright, so let's go over this. First, we're going to identify each of the points on the line, so we can see that we have these different points here. We have -4, 1, and then we have -2, 2, and then we have 0, 3, and then we have 2, 4, and then we have this point up here on the arrow, which is 5, 4. I'm going to erase this point real quick and just point this out. So sometimes when we're looking at these graphs, the arrow is actually on a point. So you can tell when the arrow is on a point and when the arrow is not on a point. For example, down here, this arrow is not on an exact point, so we would not use that as a point, but this one up here is on a point. So we're going to use that as one of the points on the line. So again, really just to find slope, you only need the 2 points, but I wanted to make sure that you saw all these points on the line, just so we're reiterating that point. Alright, so next we're going to find the slope of the line, which we talked about yesterday, which is the change in y divided by the change in x, or the rise over the run. So we're going to rise and run to get to our next point. So we're going to start at -4, 1, and we're going to go up 1, so it's a positive 1. And then we're going to go over 2, so it's a positive 2. And our slope is rise over run. So our slope on this one is positive 1 over 2. 1 over 2 cannot be reduced, so that is our slope of this line. You could have picked any of the 2 points to do this, and you should still get rise 1, run 2. So it doesn't matter which points you use. Even if you use 2 points that are far away from each other, it will reduce to 1 over 2. So make sure you have that on your green paper. Alright, so go ahead and take out your notebooks. We're going to take some notes. Alright, so a little bit about slope. We talked about yesterday how slope is rise over run. Another way we can think of this in terms of rate of change is the change in y over the change in x. So this part right here is what I want you to have down in your notebooks. Remember that little delta symbol? We call this delta, means change. Alright, so the change in y divided by the change in x. This relates to rise over run because if you think about it, our y-axis goes up and down, so that's our rise, our change in y. Alright, and then our x-axis is our run, which goes left and right, and that's our x. So it's just our change in y divided by our change in x, or our rise divided by our run. Remember, as we go through this video, just raise your hand and let your teacher know if you need to pause. Alright, so let's go back to the warm-up. You do not need to draw this graph in your notebook, but I need you to pay attention on to how we're going to get these points. So we had these points on the graph, and then we were able to find the slope from the graph. Today we're going to be given a table, and we're going to be finding the slope from a table. But I wanted to show you guys real quick that this table of values is coming from a graph. So it's all the same points that we saw yesterday on the graph. We're just looking at them in a different representation. You'll see a lot through this unit that we can do the same types of things through different representations, and it's going to be a lot of equations, graphs, and tables. So you'll see that all of these representations relate in some way. There's just different ways to represent things. Kind of like if you're reading a story, you can read it from words or you can read it from pictures. So there's just different ways that we can represent different situations. Alright, so basically, when we're making a table, we're just taking these ordered pairs that you found on the graph and we're putting them in table form. So we're still using those x and y values. Whoops. No, here we go. Alright. So we're just taking those points that we listed out from the graph and we're making them into a table. Whenever we list an ordered pair, our x value always comes first. So that's exactly where we moved the x values in the table, and then we moved our y values to the y part of the table. If you've never made a table before, the x values always go on the left side, the y values always go on the right side, and then we always want it to be in an increasing order. So when we go from top to bottom in this table, we always want the x values to be increasing. So your smaller x values should be on the top, while your bigger x values should be on the bottom. And they should always be in that order. All right, so then we've already found the slope of this line, and we know it's a positive 1 over 2. So if we look at this table, we can also find the slope of the line. So just like we went up 1, all right, we can look at our y values because remember the rise is the y-axis. All right, so if we look at our y values in the table and we look at a pattern here. So we're going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Well, each of those, in order to get to the next one, we're just adding 1. So you can see that either from the graph or from the table, we're getting the exact same pattern as adding 1. So let's see if that happens with our x values. So our x values is the run or over, all right? And on the graph, we are adding 2. So let's take a look at our x values in the table. When we look, we're going from -4 to -2, 0 to 2, and then 2 to 4. And you know that in order to get from one of those to the other one, we are adding 2. So again, the run is the same as the change in the x values. All right, and then we just talked about the slope is the change in y divided by the change in x. So our change in y is the positive 1, and our change in x is the positive 2, so our slope is still going to be 1 over 2. Whoops. Which we just talked about that. All right, so what I want you to do is go ahead and find the points for this graph. Go ahead and pause the video and find the points, all the points for this graph. Again, you don't need to write down the graph, you just need to write down all the points for the graph in your notebook. All right, so if we take a look at the points on this graph, we'll have -4, 4, -2, 1, 0, -2, and again the arrow is one of the points on this one, 2, -5. So go ahead and make a table out of these graphs. So draw your XY table. Whoops, don't want to give the answer away. Draw your XY table and see if you can make a table out of these graphs. Pause the video if you need more time to do this. All right, so here's our table. All your x values, -4, -2, 0, 2, should be in that order. -4, -2, 0, 2. All right, and then all your y values should be paired with the appropriate x values. Okay, now we want to find our change in y divided by our change in x. So how do we get from 4 to 1, or -2 to, or 1 to -2, -2 to -5? Well, we're going to be subtracting 3. And it doesn't matter which pair of numbers you look at on this table. You can look at any of them because it's a linear function. They're not going to change. They're all going to be -3. All right, be sure you are writing this down in your notebooks. This is what we'll be looking for. All right, and then we are looking for our change in our x values. So to get from -4 to -2, -2 to 0, and 0 to 2, we are adding 2. All right, so our slope, again, is our change in y divided by our change in x. So our change in y is a -3, and our change in x is a +2. So our slope in this one is -3 over 2. Pause the video if you need more time writing this down. So in your notes right now, you should have all of this written down except for the graph, and everything we did on the last slide right now except for the graph. All right, so go ahead and take a second to write these tables down in your notes. If you just want to make a T-chart, you don't have to draw the whole table. Just make a T-chart with X and Y. You don't have to draw every single line. And then make sure you write down all the numbers. All right, so we got to think about this in terms of slope. Remember, slope is our change in y divided by our change in x. So we're going to find the difference in our y values, and we're going to divide that by the difference in our x values. So if we look at the change in our y values here, how do we get from 11 to 18, 18 to 25, and 25 to 32? Well, if we look at this, we know that we are adding 7 each time. All right, how do we get from 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20? Which, a little side note, please be sure you are paying attention to the x values. They are in ascending order from least to greatest. Remember, that's all we always want. All right, so our pattern in this one, we're adding 5 each time. So if our slope is our change in y divided by our change in x, our slope is going to be a positive 7 over 5. All right, so I want you to go ahead and try this video. Try this table. Pause the video to take some time to do this. All right, hopefully you found the slope and you found it to be a negative 3 over 2, which we write with the negative out in front, negative 3 over 2. All right, so I want you to pause the video and see if you can figure these two out. Okay, so on the first one, we want to find our change in y. So if we look at our y values, we're looking for the difference in our y values, and we're adding 3 each time. All right, and our change in x, well, they're all 2, so they're never changing. So we're adding 0 each time. So our change in y divided by our change in x is 3 divided by 0. Now, what is 3 divided by 0? For those of you saying 0, check again. Type 3 divided by 0 in your calculators. What do you get? You should get an error, because we are not allowed to divide by 0. That's a rule. All right? So when we're dividing by 0 here, that is not a rule. You get an error. All right? So can anybody have an idea of what this is called, thinking about Mr. Slope yesterday? If you said undefined, you are correct, because we can't divide by 0, so it is undefined. So anytime your x values do not change, your slope is going to be undefined, because we cannot divide by 0. All right, on number 2, if we look at our change in y, our y values are not changing, so we're adding 0 each time. Now, don't jump to undefined, because last time our y values were changing. This time our x values are changing, but our y values are not. So these two are not the same. All right, the change or difference in our x values, we're adding 1 each time. So our change in y divided by, oops, that is not the right way. Our change in y divided by our change in x. Now, what is 0 divided by 1?